Now we're going to start with the panel about denialism of the climate change with a perspective of the left. Our intention is to polemize with and interpret about the scientific basis of denialism of climate change of Trump and his allies, why the far right gives a lot of importance to the cultural battle and the fight against Wokism, and how do we relate the current scenario of capitalist decomposition and the plundering of the environment and gender oppressions and xenophobia. So to start this panel, we now give the word to Renan Vega Cantor. He's an historian, teacher from Colombia, doctor of the Paris University. So, Renan.
Buenas tardes, buenas noches.
Good afternoon, good night, good days, depending on where you are. Those who are present or assisting virtually this event. And I want to thank the invitation to present some reflections on this topic, which is a very broad topic, and we can only scratch the surface in such a little time. So I want to begin with the suggestion of the comrades of focusing on the topic of denialism. The point of denialism joins all these issues, the imperialist action nowadays, the attack of capitalism, xenophobia, racism, and also the woke ideology. I think this concept of denialism helps to articulate all these elements. We should talk about not in the about denialism singular, but as a plural, because I would say that there are like three levels of denialism. The first one, which is a zero level, which is denialism with the expression saying that during World War II, there was no killing of the Jewish population by the National Socialist politics, but the genocide was not about the extermination of the Gypsy population or the black population, but it was a sector that was killed by the Nazis. This type of denialism, until recently, was a thing of the past. Or so we thought so, and we would not come back to that situation. But there's an event currently that proves that this denialism has not disappeared, which is a genocide that is taking place against the Palestinian population. That is level zero of denialism, which is in the most elemental level, the most evident one. And we don't need a lot of knowledge about the law or the precision of the terms to realize that what we're seeing is a genocide against the population of Palestine, with all the letters. And we can also say that the word genocide is not enough to describe the magnitude of what is going on Palestinian territory by the army of Israel and the participation of the US and other powers of the Western world. In the case of this genocide, we could say that it's an ecocide as well, a destruction of land, a waterside, a destruction of rivers and reservoirs of water. It is a destruction of women, a femicide, killing of children, and destruction of schools and universities, and all of the cultural instruments that are required for the existence of people. Denialism, type 0, is at the order of the day. It is not in the past, like some would think. And also, what the Zionist propaganda wants to make us think. because this is a setback for humanity to the levels of the 20th century with colonialism and World War II, and even far behind, like the 16th century onwards. Type 2 would be denialism type 1, level 1, which is related to one of the topics of today, which is climate chaos. Climate denialism is not new. It also has a history that goes back to the last 40 years and has also gone through phases. The first one started in the 1980s. We can call it corporative denialism, when big corporations, especially the oil sector and the car sectors, associated and created a lobby in the US with the intention of deny that the global climate is changing and that modification is a result of the generation of greenhouse gases produced by the capitalist model. So there was a denialist crusade with strategies that are repeated nowadays. What are those instruments? First, to use journalists and the massive media to present a campaign that in reality there was no climate issue, there was not an increase in greenhouse gases, in carbon dioxide, methane, so there was nothing to worry about. But at the same time, other scientists were contacted to sign articles that condemned the progress of climate science and studies that proved that there was an effect on and a change in climate compared to the pre-industrial era. They also turned to pressure on universities, the academic world, so certain scientists and experts on climate were censored and their articles were not published. And also they started to question the certainties of those researches, saying that the results were not convincing, that they were only hypotheses, that there was no proof that the climate of the world was changing. But inside of this denialism, there was also a tendency called cynicism, which is that in reality what they called climate change, it was actually beneficial for humanity, that more CO2 was like a blessing. So there was nothing to worry about because there was more contamination, more CO2, because it is also related to the creation of life, because the creation of life is related to these gases, but not in these tolerable levels. They were saying that CO2 was something vital for humanity and society, and there was nothing to worry about. And there was another phase of climate denialism, which is more recent, that is not corporate, although corporations participate in it, because most of the corporations, even the oil corporations, accepted that there were climate transformations. So they introduced the term of sustainable development, saying that it was possible to achieve capitalism progress and climate stability. So they created oxymorons, and they talked about clean oil, clean carbon, which is a slogan of many oil companies, especially state oil companies, saying that they produce clean oil barrels, which is an oxymoron, it's a contradiction. There are no clean oil barrels. In the case of Colombia, there are no clean oil barrels in climate terms or in human terms, because every barrel in Colombia is also filled with blood, which is a characteristic of this country. But I'm not getting into that right now. So in this phase of transition, climate denialism was relegated because corporations didn't follow it. And we are in the current phase of denialism, which is when the Republican Party adopted the positions that were more anti-scientific in this field, which are not characteristic only to the Republican Party, but it is part of the far right of the world. There is a nexus that is rarely highlighted: the expulsion of migrants and the transformations of climate reality. It is a nexus between racism of the white nation, persecution of migrants, and denialism of climate change. The links, in this sense, are very subtle, and these are the following. First, we need to highlight that climate change is not negative, and if it had negative effects, it was not the fault of the white population of the US, but of migrants. Migrants, especially those who are considered inferior, because there's a lot of racism involved. These inferior migrants come to the clean countries of the global north, the US and the EU. They go to contaminate. Those who bring climate issues are migrants, and thus the persecution to migrants is justified with as a climate protection of the borders of the great powers. That is part of the current denialism, and it is extended. The corporations of the first phase have a crucial role. So we have companies of the car manufacturing sector, the oil sector, who participate in this campaign, saying that there are no actual climate problems. The climate issue is just a thing of global Marxism to destroy the achievements of the capitalist civilization, and that Western civilization is something marvelous, and it is being destroyed by the immigrations. So in Europe, there was a renaissance of racism, and in the case of the US, it is a racism against different kinds of migrants, especially those who come from the rest of America. So there is a link between climate denialism and the persecution of migrants. So you can say that, in this sense, the project of the conservatives, of the far right of the US and great part of Western Europe, is not so far-fetched to relate these two things. The persecution of migrants and racism increases, and it just creates this idea of the white person that enjoys the benefits of the US model, and that's because they have prevented the entering of migrants. So the migrant issue is not only a demographic issue, but it is related to a whole apparatus that is justifying the transformations of the climate. So what does it have to do with the woke ideology? I think that we need to highlight a premise. Woke ideology is not emancipation. It is not a leftist project. It is not revolutionary. Woke ideology, which was also used in recent years. Academics say that in 2016, They say that the woke ideology was being talked about so less than 10 years. But in the US, it has been used for several years for the black population. But it was popularized in 2016 in the US. So what do we understand by woke ideology? They are ideas of identity politics in certain sectors that are seen separately. So woke ideology assimilates demands that are historicals and they are valid. Who can question the demands of women or the demands of the African American population in the US? Who can question the critics to racism? Who can question the emergency of the new sexualities? But that is not the issue. The issue is the way that all of these demands are used and they are removed from their anti-capitalist nature. So it is a famous struggle that is focused on the issue of class and the way that class and gender are related. It is only focused on an identity demand, which is increasingly more divided, and with some elements that are denialist, the denialism of history. Wokism is related to the right in the denial of history. We see that Donald Trump is going to impose Columbus Day as a celebration of the country of the US. That is a historical denialism. It denies the European genocide during the colonization of America, which is one of the worst genocides. But wokism is also denialist of history in another way. Wokism associated to the African American population denies the existence of slavery. What do we mean? It's not that it doesn't say that slavery doesn't exist, but it says that it is necessary to forget about slavery, because when we talk about slavery related to the African American population, we are victimizing it. So to avoid victimizing it, it is better to turn the page. And as a result, we have very grotesque things in university which has been transformed on the inside or destroyed. If a professor is going to teach a class about slavery, it is forbidden, even with a Marxist perspective of slavery. They tell him that he can't touch that topic because that is victimizing the current African American population. So they revise all the scholar programs and they remove all of the topics that may cause pain to the African American population. And it is denialism. They remove the history with all the pain that history has. We need to look how we re-examine that history and how that history brings elements for the struggle of the present. Wokism only focuses on sector struggles and historical denialism in victimizing, and thus it identifies with Israel, which considers victimism as one of its characteristics, and which has turned the World War II into a very profitable idea, using it to justify the attack on the Palestinians. So it is something very characteristic. Someone that considers themselves a victim is right, just because of it. Talking about victimism is turning human beings on passive. passive protagonists. They never reject the ways of domination. They never go for alternative models. They are only passive victims, and just that. And Wokism also has an element which is nefarious of political correctness, and it is a transformation of language. The language of the class struggle disappears, and also the language of confrontation, because Wokism says that generalizes a victimization. So we cannot talk about exploitation and oppression or national liberation, because that is to victimize sectors of that tribe that was constituted, especially in the university world, in the US and in some places of Europe. And I would say that also in Australia and New Zealand. Those are phenomena that we need to take into account. Those are elements that join denialism in those three ways. And I want to synthesize this because we are going back in historical terms against illustration, because reason is not important anymore. And it is really important because there are no critical reflections because of the antisocial networks. They are instruments that spread all the lies that we can imagine. And with a great electoral strength, because Trump had 67 million votes, and part of his propaganda is made through digital media, through social media. And that propaganda is accompanied by a huge number of lies. We can say that through the media, Goebbels has come to life again, and lies have become the daily element that many citizens and countries consume. In fact, the social media say that today is going to rain. People believe it because that's what anti-social media say. All of the lies that they say about historical terms or social terms, all of those that increase racism, xenophobia, hatred towards women, the Muslims, they have an immediate repercussion. And with the use of anti-social media, there have been genocides like the genocide of the Mar, where thousands of people were eliminated of an ethnic group which were considered enemies on social media of a Buddhist tribe of Myanmar, and that ended up being a genocide that is little known. There is the overview that I want to propose in this panel, and I hope that I was able to respect the time. And thank you very much. Thank you for the comrade Renan, Vega, Cantor. Now we continue in the panel with the comrade Cele Fierro, former legislator of the city of Buenos Aires, leader of Juntas a la Izquierda and the MST in Argentina. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good night, good morning. Those who are following us through the virtuality and the comrades who are here present, thank you for being here. Renan took an important part of the debate on Wokism and other topics, and we wanted to grab that concept to respond and explain our position on what is the feminism, the socialist feminism and revolutionary feminism that we need to build the debates fundamentally with other currents. In the last couple of years, we have seen that anti-woke has become a flag of the far right. Trump, here Milei. In Argentina, we haven't seen the attack on leftists and communism, and then when he goes abroad, he talks about the woke culture to align with the far right internationally. And it has a common element, which is because with Renan we share the critique on wokism or woke culture. But on this side, we also need to discuss why these sectors that are reactionary and conservative are the ones that raise these anti-woke flags. And they have a goal, because they come to attack and we know them well. Everything that meant the fourth wave of the feminist movement internationally. Here in Argentina, we define it from 2015, more or less. And that wave had characteristics that are very important, and we highlight it in that moment. And they surpassed the previous one, not only because of the massivity of those actions, this movement of women, and it was against institutions of this regime, of this system of capitalism and patriarchy, and which quickly, with a current that disputes those ideas, could become into anti-capitalist, that consciousness of struggle on the streets. The far right took that, they took those anti-woke flags to attack those rights of gender that were conquered during the last period. But not only the gender rights, the rights as a whole, because it questions social rights, democratic rights, and it puts as an axis that those struggles are of an elite of privileged people. And there we have a debate with currents from cultural wokism, but also of other currents inside of feminism, that we define that inside of feminism, or the feminisms, like we say, there are different currents. It is a polyclassist movement. We find sectors of the bourgeoisie, liberal feminism, reformist sectors, the one we know, and that in other countries we have seen. And there was a development here in this country, which are radical feminism, and also the identity politics, which is linked to the concept of wokism. The goal of the far right is to achieve and eliminate all rights of the workers, of popular sectors, of women, diversities, to reset, in a way, the capitalist system, which is in crisis, so to turn it into one where exploitation is even greater, so they can have more profitability. So why do we have this enemy, women, diversities? They are the ones who come out to fight, to organize. That's why they focus on them. And it has a relation with the fourth wave of the feminist movement, because then you cannot explain it, why they have this axis. Because these are sectors that took steps to acknowledge the unity that exists, the relation that exists, the patriarchy and exploitation. If there's that link, we shouldn't only fight for finishing oppression or patriarchy, we should only unify if we don't overthrow the system of capitalist that uses patriarchy to oppress and exploit even more, it will be very difficult. So the far right tries to mix all of these sectors of struggle in relation to the different organizations and currents that are also activists in the environmental movement, the different groups of activists of the migrant sector. Renan said it. The woke concept was retaken in 2016. Trump, with his campaign of re-election, did a whole campaign against Wokism, but it's actually a very old concept which refers to the struggle of the African American sectors, which is to wake up and have consciousness about these oppressions. It tries to amalgamate all of the sectors that are struggling, and it unifies under these flags with this goal to eliminate certain rights, but above all, to win a social base with an ideology, a social base. And I link it again with the fourth wave of the feminist movement. That social base are men, young men, and that social base, ideologically, they want to win them for reactionary positions and also anti-revolutionary positions, to try to install a new order in the model of this capitalism that is in crisis that we are living right now. It is part of polarization of society and politics that we are seeing and we define. It is a dispute, the world as a whole. It is part of that cultural battle that is done in the field of the ideas of the class struggle. It is part of the constant tension for the strength relations to implement this change and this defeat that they want to carry out against the working class. So what they try to do is to impose these new ways of the capitalist system to increase exploitation and oppression, so that the balance turns to their favor. And also, we talked about denialism or the denialisms of the environment, of climate, how they try to, through this new moment, they try to bring us to a flat earth idea of, and they try to question things that were scientifically proven, and in terms of gender as well. They say that there is no patriarchy, there is no gender inequality, there is no homophobia, there is no misogyny. So this does exist, and we need to fight against it. We need to continue fighting. And they don't want to do it because this is what generates more consciousness. For us, it is key to go against all these sectors of anti-Wokism, of this far right that is growing internationally, that governs in many sectors. The way to defeat it is to continue carrying out the greatest unity on the streets, to completely overthrow them without any sectarianism. So we have the debate inside of the movement, of the feminist movement, of activism, of the left, because I said it before, inside of feminism, there are different currents, different sectors. We have the sectors that are more liberal, bourgeois, that can fight for equality of women, gender, but from the point of view of legality, without changing or criticizing the capitalist system, which generates this oppression. Then we have reformists, which criticize the system, oppression, exploitation, but they conform with partial reforms inside of the capital. We have sectors like radical feminism, which divide the gender, or Wokism in terms of identities, that struggles should be separate. We cannot fight, we cannot show solidarity for other people's causes. Then we have socialist feminism, which is the one we propose. And we need to build it now more than ever. We need to confront these sectors so they cannot impose their ideas. We need to go out and fight them. And we need to face them with policies that allow us to say we need to fight for more rights, because they made us believe that we can't, because there are sectors of these feminisms, they say, no, we went too far with the struggles in terms of gender. No, we are halfway. They made us believe that we had too many rights and this is the end, and they paved the way for sectors to say that. They say, oh, we were talking about too many rights that we have conquered, but these rights were not guaranteed. We need to fight for building a feminism that takes those flags and fights to regain the lost rights and gain new rights, but to not stay halfway, because we need to achieve that unity between what patriarchy means, these oppressions, and the capitalist system, which is the one that generates the most inequality and exploitation, the one we need to overcome. We need to build organization in each of these spaces, in each of these movements, and we need to overcome it to build in terms of politics. There we have the necessity of building to dispute power, to avoid the separation of class. There is no class, so it is key to say that that inequality is the main one, because it isn't the same, the thing that they want to sell, that there's a female president, or that the CEO of a company is a woman and is a lesbian, or that we have a trans person in a position of power. But what we need to discuss is that everyone, all the workers, male and female, are the ones that make decisions, and to change from the roots this system, because it generates exploitation and inequality. We need to unify all of these struggles to build a militancy from the working class, to build another state with the power of the workers, and to think about building another social model, a socialist model that is anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchy, without all the levels of oppression, exploitation that we have now, without any borders. So a militancy that operates from that place and faces and defeats once and for all this far right that raises its flags with the only goal of continuing crushing the working class and the popular sectors, women, and diversities.
Gracias, Cele Fierro. Ahora continuamos.
Thank you, Cele Fierro. Now we have the panel Lilli Campbell, activist of the environment and member of Socialist Alternative from Australia.
Hello, good morning from Australia. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you. It's a privilege to be on this panel with lots of great speakers, and the translation is impeccable. I wanted to talk first a bit about the new climate denialism, which Renan started to talk about, which is very interesting, which we are now living through in all across the world, but also to talk about what is happening in Australia and the activism that we've been organizing over the past few years in response to the climate crisis, which has been very important. Around the world right now, I think Trump is leading political leaders in a new wave of climate denialism, and they are launching a very scary new wave of destruction on the environment. Trump, though, has, of course, always been very enthusiastic about fossil fuels and has always disdained climate science. So his campaign slogan this time was "Drill, baby, drill." And his campaign promised to terminate what he called the Green New Scam, which was the Green New Deal. He said that this was the greatest scam in history. In an interview as well with Elon Musk, he scoffed at the prospect of sea level rises and said, oh, this will mean more oceanfront property for him and Musk, which is terrifying. But as well, I think Trump 2.0 this time is much worse than Trump was the first time around on the environment. There are some similarities, but a lot of differences. In the first 100 days this time, Trump has launched a really unprecedented assault on the environment, 145 actions to get rid of environmental legislation in just 100 days. And this is more than was completed in his whole first term as the American president. On his first day, he signed at least 3 different executive orders, one against the UN Convention on Climate Change, and a whole bunch more. Earlier this month as well, Trump has continued. He dismantled the entire State Department Office for Global Change. He just terminated all of the employees, and this was again an initiative of DOGE, or Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency. People may have seen he has a head of the Environmental Protection Agency called Lee Zeldin, and he describes his mission as driving a dagger through the heart of climate change religion, and this will usher in America's golden age. So he is a culture warrior fighting for his side, and he sees the war on environmental protection as part of restoring America to the golden era. You can see how this links up with a whole lot of the Trump ideological agenda, clearly. Amidst all of the cuts to protections that have been long established in the US or more recently established, they've also been very seriously bolstering the fossil fuel industry. One of the ways they've been doing this is pressuring other countries to buy into their liquefied natural gas project in Alaska. And this could emit more than 2.3 billion tons over the next 30 years. So I'm going to try and explain this a little bit, or add a little bit to what Renan was saying. I think some of what he's doing is purely ideological. There's a kind of far-right anti-science irrationalism that drives several departments, the Department of Health as well. Zeldin says that any money that's ever spent on the environment is just cover for shoveling money towards left-wing activists. I wish that would be nice. Unfortunately, that is not the case. And Trump's master plan to, if people have seen, eradicate paper straws, is a 36-page national strategy document that bears the presidential seal and involves all of these different agencies from across the government. And this seems ridiculous that they care so much about this. But I think it's issues like this, mushy paper straws, the shower heads, whatever, that gets Trump's face really revved up. Mushy paper straws and weak showers don't fit with the hyper-masculine, strongman image of the world that the far right idolizes. And so I think he sees them as an easy and symbolic target on the war on perceived weakness and wokeness. But there's more to it as well. I think the core message of Trump's war on woke is simple. Basically, companies should be able to do whatever they want in order to turn a profit, regardless of the damage that they inflict on people or the planet or whatever else. And I think the wave of deregulation across the board is designed to empower the capitalist class and weaken as well the working class's ability to defend itself against attacks. And this is very important to restoring profitability at home and also projecting American power overseas in the rest of the world. So Trump says that we will be a rich nation again, and it's the liquid gold under our feet that will help us to do that. And he's referring to the oil and gas across America, which makes it one of the wealthiest countries in the world. This is having major effects on the corporate world and also in different countries as well. So pretending to care about climate change, which is what they've done for the last 20 years, is now out of fashion in the ruling class. There's been a mass exit of banks from the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Companies like Starbucks or Meta, so Facebook, have been dropping their climate goals and also removing references to the climate in all of their statements. And also the European Union, people may have seen, they're considering a range of measures to water down their Green Deal. In response to all this, it's easy, people mentioned before, to think the alternative would be to just go back to normal. But I think important to emphasize, like the others, that the normal was not getting us anywhere anyway. Before Trump came to power, it was Biden and Harris that took oil and gas production in America to record highs. And I think looking to Australia is useful perhaps for others in the world. It's a very clear example of the complicity of the political centre in climate vandalism for a very long time. Today, I have to go and vote because there is a federal election. There is a choice. I get to choose between one man who wants to rip coal out of the earth very loudly and one man who wants to rip coal out of the earth while he talks about saving koalas and saving the planet. Neither of these are good options. For the past 3 years, the Labor government here, it's like the Alternative Workers' Party, have governed for the rich. They've opened up more than 30 new coal and gas projects, and they've blocked any legislation that could provide any minor hassle for the fossil fuel billionaires that run this country. The criminal lies of the Labor Party have very serious consequences for the rest of the world and not just for us. Australia presents itself as a small fry player in global climate change. But when the emissions from Australia's fossil fuel exports are added to domestic emissions, Australia is a major contributor to global warming and climate change. In fact, it is the second largest climate polluter when you add in fossil fuel exports to the mix. In the election, there is also a Greens party that is running here, and their position is no new coal and gas. But this really is meaningless. Their strategy for making change is forming government with Labor. And what this means is they will agree to whatever position Labor is willing to agree to. They've decided that compromise is the best way forward. So we need to build some kind of alternative to all of this. I think seeing that mining and resource extraction has made big money here for a very long time, it's central to Australia's long-term wealth. This has insulated the country for years against some of the worst economic conditions that have been felt elsewhere in the world. So we haven't had the same kinds of crisis and problems. The mining industry is really so powerful that it brought down a government in 2010 when there was a government that was threatened by threatening the fossil fuel industry with a minimal tax on mega profits of coal and gas. The mining industry said no and got rid of that government pretty swiftly. Every government knows that backing up the mining industry then is essential to staying in power, and it's essential to supporting their own interests. So potential for expanding overseas and such. And I think there's very close connection between the politicians of all the parties and the mining industry. Makes it very clear that we cannot rely on politicians to make change for us. Nobody is going to come and save us from the climate crisis but ourselves. In Australia, our group has, which is Socialist Alternative, has played a big part in organising very serious, large protests for the climate. Tens of thousands of people have been brought onto the streets. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this. The height of the climate movement here has passed. It came with the climate strikes and started from about 2018 onwards. And it was really positive when it came along because it shifted a lot of the right-wing narratives that had dominated the climate movement for a long time. So instead of people talking about shorter showers or lifestyle solutions or taxing working class consumption habits, instead people wanted to talk about why we needed system change instead of climate change, why we need to think about profits and capitalism and not looking to police ordinary people's behaviors. I think the climate strikes in Australia turned out to be some of the biggest in the world. There was up to 350,000 people demonstrating on a workday in 2019 to call for climate action. They focused their anger, these big demonstrations, on the government of Scott Morrison, who's a liberal and conservative, and he was famous at the time for taking a lump of coal into Parliament to show off to everyone, to tell everyone in climate denial style, you shouldn't be afraid of this, it's not going to come and hurt you. And they really hated this guy, which was really positive. While these actions, definitely had a massively positive effect, bringing mass politics back to the streets, it was difficult to intervene sometimes into these strikes because they were organized quite tightly by an environmental NGO that is quite moderate and supportive of the Labor Party. We did what we could and organized where we could important contingents that could march from universities and workplaces into the city to join the climate strikes, but it was difficult for us to intervene much. In lots of places, our group instead joined up with Extinction Rebellion. There were lots of weaknesses in the politics of this group, but it was an easier place for us to intervene and make arguments that there should be more protests, that people should get onto the streets more, that sort of thing. Our experience in intervening into this was kind of uneven across the country. So in some places it was good, some places we didn't do so well. It was more successful in Melbourne, where we were able to find lots more people who wanted to take action. Melbourne is also a more left-wing city, and also our organization is bigger there, quite a lot bigger. So we in Melbourne were able to set up and also joined a whole number of suburban branches of Extinction Rebellion. And these organized lots and lots of small protests all around the city. For a while, it was like one protest happens every day in every suburb in 2019. At this time, we found that it was quite easy to meet people at these protests who had drawn the conclusion themselves that it was capitalism that was to blame for the climate crisis. But in general, the political level remained quite low at this time. So people could carry a sign that says, we need a change in the system. But what that means to them is we need a change in the government rather than a change to capitalism. But then the Black Summer bushfires started, and that happened at the end of 2019. These were totally enormous, catastrophic fires. They burnt an area equivalent to the size of the United Kingdom. Nearly 80% of all the Australian population was affected by the bushfires, either directly or indirectly. And being there, it was apocalypse. Hazardous levels of black smoke hung over Sydney and most of New South Wales, which is the state that I live in, for months and months and months. I went to the coast for a month, or about a month after the fires happened, and the waves at the coast were black with ash from the fires at the time. And the sky was still black at different times of the day. The Morrison government's response to the bushfires and the treatment of the victims of the bushfires demonstrated a very sharp class divide in Australian society. The capitalist class and the state and the ruling parties of Australia were united in their contempt for ordinary people. There were whole families who were abandoned on the beaches in this very wealthy country with no food and no support for days, whilst it was that the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, went on holiday to Hawaii, and they were very, very slow and late to wheel out the army or provide any kind of support for ordinary people in this crisis. The whole country was totally fuming. There were all of these videos of Scott Morrison going around trying to pretend to be an ordinary person and shake people's hands, but people didn't want to talk to him, didn't want to shake his hand, didn't want to say hello. It was a great moment for us. So in November, we organized a protest in Sydney of about 30,000 people to protest the bushfires. And particularly this was about protesting the blanket of smoke that was covering the city that people were forced to work in and breathe in all of the time. And the fact that 30,000 people showed up, even though we just put up a Facebook event, it went viral on the internet, revealed to us how much anger was brewing in this issue at the time. Then in January, we organized another protest, and this was called Sack Scott Morrison, so sack the government. And about 60,000 people came in Sydney, but it was probably about 150,000 across the whole country. And these were very important protests. They were able to galvanize lots of ordinary people against the climate crisis, against the climate deniers. And this was possible because this was a moment when the climate crisis was real and people could see the impacts of it and were furious about how the government was treating them. In recent years, things have been more difficult for us to organize. First, there was COVID, which made organizing difficult in lots of places. But also then there was the new Albanese Labour government. And his memo is about greenwashing. And this was able to diffuse a lot of the anger about climate change because they said, oh, like, we care about climate, we're going to bring emissions down, blah, 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 all a lot of rubbish. On top of this as well, the government has put lots of money into and resources into oppressing and repressing the climate movement. And they've made it much more difficult for us to organize and protest. So one example of this, at the end of last year, I went to a blockade in Newcastle, where there is the world's largest coal port. They export like many, many millions of tons of coal every year all around the world. Recently also to Israel in the midst of the genocide. And in this moment, the government made unprecedented moves to make it illegal for us to paddle out onto the water in boats to try and stop these coal ships going by. And they arrested, I think, 150 people at this protest, which was quite shocking. I think that we can expect with more climate disasters coming and more climate deniers in power around the world that more Black summers are going to happen and we'll need more protests to happen as well. I think we need more socialists in the world for that to happen though. And we need more socialists to be arguing for the politics that are necessary as well to take those movements forward against whichever government comes our way, because really they're all climate deniers. The right has linked together all of these issues that we've been talking about under the banner of woke. And they are very consciously waging war on all of them, all of these issues at once. I think their project is to turn up the dial on capitalism to the absolute max. And that means that they have to turn up oppression and repression, ideology and madness to the max at the same time. I think we would do well to learn from them. We need to be organizing our side of the war in response and link together all of these issues and link together the fight back for a better world against both the woke and the anti-woke for a socialist future. Thanks, comrades.
And now we are going to present our last panelist, Justin Akers Chacón, professor of Chicano Studies and member of Socialist Horizon. As we have heard during this forum, Trump and his far-right allies have a fighting element, which is the permanent attack towards immigrants and xenophobia. And this is important because Justin is an activist who does political work regarding this issue at the borders and this issue of immigrants and Trump's administration and militarization of the borders is a really important issue. So, Justin, you can go ahead. Thank you.
Hola, muchas gracias. Thank you. And greetings from the U.S.-Mexico border region. The state repression, I should say, of migrants in the United States has accelerated under Trump, under the second term of Trump. But in reality, it's been accelerating under both parties and has become a permanent bipartisan feature of the U.S. political landscape going back to the early 90s. Most recently, under the second regime of Trump, the racist criminalization has reached a heightened stage. Aggressive ICE agents have been deployed in different parts of the country to snatch people from homes and public spaces in a show of force designed to instill terror and sow fear, especially in the migrant and refugee communities across the country. And as people well know, this targeting has also been expanded from undocumented workers to legal resident immigrants who have participated in pro-Palestinian protests or have in any way publicly expressed solidarity with Palestine. The framing of immigration politics in the U.S., whether by the Democratic or Republican politicians, the corporate media, all of the mainstream avenues, has and continues to promote and reinforce the narrative that migrants are a threat, are prone to criminal activity, are a burden on society, are gang members, abuse public resources. These are the narratives, and what accounts to or what accounts for a liberal alternative is to say that migrants are just hapless victims from countries incapable or unwilling to provide for their needs. There is no analysis of how migrants and refugees are largely displaced from their home countries by factors connected to imperialism, neocolonialism, and associated environmental factors connected to these issues. And this is because both parties and the corporate structures of U.S. society see the criminalization of migrant labor as important to how capitalism can maximize accumulation through super exploitation of millions of workers. And so the denialism of these sectors, the denialism, of the especially of the form and function of the Democratic Party, which is supposed to represent the liberal alternative, reveals how right-wing and bankrupt mainstream liberal ideas and politics have become in a period of deepening crisis. The racist, xenophobic, and paternalistic narratives are not only blatantly false and willfully ignorant, but are designed to absolve the U.S. of culpability and to conceal how U.S. imperialism and the global capitalist system are driving deepening and compounding crises that can explain why global displacement migration is accelerating, and why capitalist states are criminalizing and increasingly weaponizing enforcement policy against migrants and refugees. Nor can liberal, social democratic, and centrist managers of the capitalist states explain or admit how their criminalization of migrants has created the political openings for far-right and fascist political movements to seize upon the issue to gain power internationally by calling for even harsher and more repressive measures. And Trump's ascendancy to the presidency both times has been predicated on the result of Democrats winning elections, promising to legalize and protect immigrants during their campaigns, but then quickly moving to the right and repressing migrants even more than the Republicans in the previous administration after they gained power. Trump's electoral victories have been based on demoralization and much lower voter turnout after the Democratic Party betrayals. A significant sector of the nonprofits, of labor unions, and liberal Democratic Party funded groups that support or claim to support immigrant workers refuse to break from or even criticize Democrats. And each cycle, including now, only call for getting the Democrats back in office so we can help migrants and refugees. There are several crisis factors in the global capitalist system and in the declining US-centric imperialist system that are accelerating what I refer to as displacement migration. And the three that I want to talk a little bit more about are the growing imperialist war, economic imperialism, and climate change and catastrophe, which is itself linked directly to the previous two. So displacement through imperialist war. Since 1970, the number of displaced people has increased each year from 84 million in 1970 to 281 million in 2020. Over 120 million people were internally displaced in their countries in 2024 alone. And 65 million people, over 120 million people were internally displaced in 2024. And 65 million people had to leave and relocate to another part of their country, and 45 million people had to leave their country altogether as refugees. The last 2 years have seen major migration and displacement events caused by imperial war, colonial war, invasion, civil war, and other types of conflict occurring in the context of inter-imperial decline and warfare and attempts at redivision, whether in Ukraine, Gaza, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Myanmar, to name a few. The US, Russia, and former colonial empires of Western Europe and China, well, current and former colonial empires of Western Europe and China have played a direct or indirect role in fomenting or aligning in some capacity within these conflicts. We are also in a period of global rearmament and war positioning, with over $2.48 trillion spent on armaments in 2024, each year since 2022 each year since 2020, excuse me. And the global rearmament costs are expected to reach $2.6 trillion by the end of this year. The U.S. under Trump in his second regime is now proposing a $1 trillion military budget for the next year. The second thing I'd like to talk about is displacement through economic imperialism. North American imperialism, U.S. imperialism, has been another significant factor in displacement migration. Between 1983 and 2006, the U.S. implemented quote-unquote free trade policies in the Caribbean, in Mexico, in Central America, with names like the Caribbean Basin Initiative, starting in 83, 84, NAFTA, and then the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, 1994 to the present, and the Central American Free Trade Agreement, which began in 2006 to the present. The impacts of each have witnessed large-scale displacement and outmigration. And this explains how and why millions of Mexicans, Central Americans, Haitians, and others have been displaced and forced to migrate into the United States. And this process has been accelerating in the last decade. Free trade agreements are, in fact, a significant factor in how U.S. imperialism functions, and a central element of neoliberal capitalist restructuring of the global economy in the last four decades, enabling a new form for the massive transfer of wealth from countries historically underdeveloped by imperialism, or countries experiencing neo or semi-colonial relations, or formerly colonized countries struggling to prevent a resubordination to U.S. imperialism, like in the case of Mexico. We can understand the U.S. motivation for imposing free trade agreements through this process in which they hold large amounts of debt in these countries that they ultimately impose free trade agreements on. And then when there are crises in paying back the debt, the U.S. has engaged in debt restructuring to basically force these countries to open up their economies to U.S. capital. And this is what has happened in Mexico, the Caribbean, and parts of the Caribbean and parts of Central America especially. This was to allow for unfettered capital export to establish or reestablish ownership and control as a function of capital accumulation to extract and repatriate as much profit as possible. For example, much of the U.S. ownership taken over Mexico's agricultural sector in the last 2 decades has been by U.S. capital reorienting production, which would have been for domestic markets, to now produce crops that can be exported back to the United States for significant profits. This, in effect, has compelled displacement migration, with transnational workers having to follow the profits moving north in search of work. This form of displacement migration also has another aspect built in, which is how capitalists can profit by using migrants as reserve armies of labor through criminalizing and depriving them of citizenship, and then using these reserve armies of labor to restructure labor markets in the United States. So criminalization actually functions as a means to keep workers' wages down, to weaken unionization efforts, and as expressed through the vile racism of Trump and much of the ruling class in this current period, by instilling xenophobic and racist divides in the working class itself. The Mexico to U.S. Migration corridor is the largest migration corridor in the world in terms of movement of people. Mexico is the top country of birth for U.S. immigrants. In 2022, roughly 10.6 million immigrants living in the U.S. were born in Mexico, making up 23% of all U.S. immigrants. The mass migration of Mexican people into the United States between 1980 and 2010 represents the largest transfer of people in modern history between countries not at war or in a non-war wartime situation. People from the rest of Latin America, especially from the Caribbean and Central America, comprise 37% of the migrants and refugees in the United States, 15% from Asian countries, 12% from Europe and Canada, and the rest from Africa and the Middle East. So we can see and correspond each wave of migration coinciding with stages of imperialist trade policy that enriches U.S. capitalists and its aligned capitalist classes and partner states in the subjected nations of these free trade agreements. The last one I want to look at, checking my time here, is climate change and forced displacement. In recent years, there have been higher instances of migration due to disasters caused by extreme weather events that have devastated communities, such as flooding, droughts, and others. Floods have affected food security, for example, in several locations in Africa between 2009 and 2020. In Nigeria, a recent study revealed that floods increased the number of food insecure households by 92%. The total number of immigrants worldwide from all sub-Saharan African countries combined grew by 31% just between 2010 and 2017. In 2022, Pakistan suffered what the Prime Minister called the worst floods in its history, destroying thousands of hectares of farmland, significantly impacting food production in the country and driving almost a quarter of that year's global disaster displacements. Over the 2022 to 2023 period, 1.6 million people emigrated from Pakistan. 60,000 entered into the United States in 2023, joining over 600,000 that have migrated to the United States since the year 2000. Two more examples. In Syria, the country with the highest rate of displaced people in the world, outmigration grew 536% between 2010 and 2017, nearly 7 million people. This began with the most extreme drought in that country's history, which lasted from 2006 to 2010. It is estimated that the Syrian drought displaced more than 1.5 million people. A 2011 report from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration attributed the main cause of that drought as compounding effects of climate change. The drought heavily impacted the rural communities of Syria's northeast, where food prices skyrocketed. And by 2010, 80% of residents in the drought-stricken regions were living under the poverty threshold and facing food insecurity as a result. The Bashar al-Assad dictatorship, facing economic downturn, curtailed subsidies and support for farmers in the region. Many people left the countryside and migrated into established encampments on the outskirts of Damascus, Hama, Homs, Aleppo, and Daraa. And it was in Daraa where the first significant protests in the country began in March of 2011, giving way to national uprisings associated with the Arab Spring, followed by 14 years of civil war, massive refugee flight, and eventually seeing the toppling of the Assad dictatorship in January of this year. The last example I want to give is migration from what's now referred to as the dry corridor of Central America. And this refers to an arid space that occupies large portions of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, where subsistence agriculture and small-scale agriculture has been the most affected, but all agriculture affected by serious drought. From 2018 to 2021, an average of 407,000 people left the Northern Triangle region each year, meaning from these countries in Central America, with most heading to the United States in what have been referred to as migrant caravanas or migrant caravans, leaving in coordinated caravans for protection and mutual support. And according to the United Nations 2024 World Migration Report, climate change will force the displacement of 216 million people who will have to migrate by 2050. And that will be within their country and across national borders. That same study also estimates that 40% of the world's total population by 2050 will live in areas highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Okay, and then the last part I want to talk about is how imperialist states and their aligned allies in the capitalist classes and state regimes where international capitalist firms engage in mining and other extractivist operations have increasingly relied on the deployment of state and private violence against environmental land and water protectors. This amidst a 2 decades commodity boom in extractive capitalism fueled by US, Canadian, European, Japanese, and Chinese firms. According to a recent study published by The Economist, Latin America holds more than a fifth of the global reserves for 5 critical metals. It already dominates the mining of copper, pervasive across green technologies, and holds nearly 60% of the world's known resources of lithium, used in all main e-vehicle type battery types. It is also rich in silver, tin, and nickel, and will benefit even if the green transition sputters, thanks to recent discoveries of oil that could see it quench 5 to 10% of global demand by 2030. So this commodities boom, which has gone through phases, is also increasing, and again driven by extractivist capitalism. And the largest beneficiaries of this extractivist capitalism are, in this order, in 2025, are the largest purchasers and acquiring these resources are China, the United States, and the European Union. Much of these new sources of mineral wealth and the commodities boom have been discovered in indigenous lands, nature reserves, and other forest jungles, and in proximity to bodies of water that sustain indigenous and non-urban populations. The process of land usurpation and resource extraction and exploitation has led to intensive conflict and repression against indigenous and other land and water protectors. More than 2,100 land and environmental defenders have been killed globally between 2012 and 2023, mostly indigenous peoples in Latin America, especially in the countries of Colombia, Mexico, Honduras, and Brazil. State police agencies, formal and informal paramilitary forces, and other irregular forces working through the state or hired by private companies kill and assassinate leaders and displace communities who are especially those trying to defend their lands. And so we see, for instance, this afflicting Central American peoples, where migration from Central America to the United States was 109,000 in 2020, increasing to 705,000 in 2022. In the first 6 months of 2023, there were 200, almost 300,000 instances of people from Central America trying to cross. And between October 2019 and March 2023, migrants from these four countries, again, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, accounted for 2 million of the 5.8 million border crossings at the southern border. Okay, and so let me check my time. I got 30 seconds. Okay, so I'll just conclude by saying I was going to talk a little bit about El Salvador and the role that Bukele is playing now as sort of operating as a Trump ally and building up the massive prison regime that has victimized tens of thousands of El Salvadorians, including many political and social activists, now becoming also the sort of repository for Trump's deported detainees, and so these are all interconnected. And so to conclude, the struggle for migrant rights, climate justice, and against imperialist war are inseparable and intricately interconnected to the struggle against capitalism, imperialism, and the states that administer them. An internationalist, revolutionary, and global socialist movement acting in coordination and in solidarity is urgently needed to build a socialist alternative to the crisis-ridden capitalist and imperialist system now driving us to the brink. Solidarity with the International Socialist League for making the effort to build this international movement and the struggle for socialism on a global scale a reality, a necessity, and a possibility. Thank you.
Bueno, compañeros, en primer
Well,
lugar,
comrades,
antes de responder a las preguntas, quiero
first,
como
before
redondear
answering the
ideas que
questions,
planteé con respecto a lo siguiente. ¿Cuál es el
I'd like
sentido
to add what's the sense, what's the intention of denialism, especially towards climate change. It's to deny the essential factor that there are physical, material limits regarding how capitalism works that we cannot avoid. They try to convince us that we can overcome these issues. How is that apply practically? For example, with the measures of Elon Musk being part of Trump's government, a far-right expression, techno-fascist, we could say, that thinks that the biggest issues of capitalism will be solved with technology, which actually deepens those problems. The technology that Elon Musk produces needs huge amounts of resources and will result in huge waves of extractivism. For example, in Argentina, with lithium, or countries that are rich in minerals like the Democratic Republic of Congo. And that's something that I want to connect with the first question that I was made between how these socio-environmental conflicts in the heart of imperialism affect the rest of the world. This appropriation of new raw materials to guarantee the production
Sí, ese es un
for
oxímoron.
green
Una
and clean
imposición.
cars, for example.
Pero lo plantean para decir entonces que estos carros eléctricos van a ser
What they
carros
say
ambientalmente
is
sanos.
that those new
se-
cars
digamos,
will
vemos
be
que se puede
environmentally
pensar para
safe or
solucionarlo así,
friendly.
hablemoslo
Let's say that that's
hipotéticamente.
possible, which is
¿Qué
not, but
implica
let's
eso?
say it was.
Que es la vieja
What does
táctica
that
de
imply? That's
la
the old
expansión colonial
tactic
en esos
of colonial
últimos 5 siglos
expansionism
de
in these
externalizar
last few
los problemas.
centuries.
Entonces, aparentemente se construyen sociedades
So
limpias
apparently,
en
clean
Europa, Estados
societies
Unidos o en Europa
can be
son así,
built
son
in
países.
Europe, in the
Pero
United
el resto del
States,
mundo
but the
vive
rest of the world
destruido ambientalmente.
will see
Sus
environmental
sus
destruction
ecosistemas
of their
desaparecen, son
ecosystem
atacados por
that
la
would
minería, por la
disappear
extracción de oro, por la extracción de platino,
and be destroyed by
viejos y nuevos
gold
minerales
extraction,
que son
lithium
indispensables para
extraction,
el
old and new
capitalismo.
mineral
Sin
extraction
esos minerales
that
el
are key
capitalismo
for
real
capitalism to
existe, no
function.
puede funcionar.
If
Porque
not,
aquí hay que
capitalism
salir combatir
wouldn't
mitos como el
work
mito de la
at all.
desmaterialización
We have
y
to
como el
fight
mito de la
against myths
digitalización que supuestamente
of
no necesita términos para la
digitalization
energía.
in which you wouldn't
Esta es una
need
falacia
either
porque si
energy
algo ha
or
consumido
minerals.
cantidades ingentes
And
de
that
agua y energía
makes no
debido a que
sense.
sea
It's a
la
clear
inteligencia
fantasy
artificial, la mal
because,
llamada
for
inteligencia
example,
artificial. ¿Sí?
artificial
Y
intelligence
entonces,
needs huge amounts
¿cómo
of water
funcionan las
to
bases de
function.
datos de
So
muchos
how
países
do
donde nosotros no vemos esa realidad?
databases work,
Con
for example, in which we see that reality,
unas grandes
in which
grandes
there are
reservas donde
huge
se almacena la información que
reservoirs of
necesitan estar
information
refrigeradas de manera
that
permanente
need
y
to be
que consumen
cooled
grandes cantidades de agua y
permanently
energía.
and
De
that
tal manera
consume
que
huge
el
quantities
capitalismo no puede
of
ignorar las
water
leyes
and
básicas de la
energy.
ecología, una
So
de las cuales dice
capitalism
que no hay almuerzo
cannot
gratis, que no hay comida
respect
gratis, que
the
todo tiene
main
un costo.
laws
Tiene un
of
costo ambiental,
ecology.
bien
Everything
sea
has an
en el
environmental
lugar
cost.
donde
Nothing
se
is
produce
free
o donde se
environmentally,
consume. Entonces, sí hay
either by the
un
place that
nexo entre
consumes
los
it or
conflictos
by the place
socioambientales
that
del centro y
produces
de la
it.
periferia.
So
Hasta el
there
punto que,
is
por
an
ejemplo,
effect between the
ahora ya
center and the periphery.
últimamente en
Today,
los
it
países
is
que pertenecen
normal
a Estados
for
Unidos o Europa
countries
se hayan regresado
like
debido
United States
al
or,
acentuamiento de las guerras
or the European Union
a volver a reivindicar el
have been
uso, por ejemplo,
forced
del carbón, como
due
es el
to
caso de
war
Alemania. Teniendo
to
en cuenta que los verdes, que antes supuestamente eran ecologistas,
celebrate the use
ahora
of coal.
reconocen que es
For
necesario
example,
usar carbón
the Greens
debido a la
that were
necesidad de
ecologists,
conectar
for example, in
gas
Germany,
y
now
gas a los Estados
have
Unidos,
to
que es casi un suicidio.
talk about
Pero a
using
cambio de
coal,
eso han vuelto a pensar en reabrir centrales,
talking about reopening
centrales grandes cantidades de
hydroelectrical
agua movidas por carbón y el uso, por
centers
ejemplo, de la
using
economía.
coal,
O en el caso de los
and the
Estados
use of
Unidos,
coal
que presumió de volver a ser el
to
primer productor de
produce,
petróleo mediante el fracking. Pero el fracking es
or
la
for
forma de
example, in the
extraer
United
petróleo,
States,
la
the use of
extracción
fracking
hidráulica
methods to
más
extract
destructiva
oil,
que hay. Tanto así
which
que
is
en
the most
Estados Unidos y en
disruptive
Canadá
method of
hay
doing so.
pueblos
In the
donde
United States
el
and in
agua
Canada, there
potable no
are
existe y el agua
neighborhoods in
que
which
sale por los pozos
drinkable
de petróleo
water does
retiran
not exist,
es agua
and
llena de petróleo.
tap
Los
water
temblores que
has
generan estos
oil or
temblores.
gas, and there
Pues en
are
esa lucha
also
mundial por los bienes
small
comunes de tipo
earthquakes.
natural, las
And that's
consecuencias se
because
ven
the
acá en el centro y allá. Aquí,
extraction
por
of
supuesto,
raw
más evidente,
materials
más destructivas, más masivas,
effects
pero
can be
también,
seen in the
digamos,
center, but
en los
also in the
Estados Unidos.
periphery.
Pero tengamos en cuenta que las consecuencias socioambientales son eso,
So,
socioambientales, no solamente la
socio-environmental
destrucción de
consequences
los
are
ecosistemas,
exactly
sino el
that,
impacto que tienen sobre los
socio-environmental
seres humanos, sobre las
consequences,
comunidades
not only
campesinas, sobre las
environmental
comunidades
consequences,
indígenas, sobre las
especially in
comunidades
rural
afrodescendientes, las que viven
communities,
generalmente en los bosques, en las zonas
Afro-ascendant
rurales, en las zonas más alejadas
communities,
de los países,
in those
en
communities
los
that
cuales se
are
aceleran los procesos
far away from
extractivistas.
big cities
Entonces
and
aquí
in
hay un
which
nexo entre el
extractivist
centro y la
methods
periferia
deepen.
y eso debería
So
posibilitar contactos transnacionales para una lucha que
that
vaya
makes
más
it
allá,
possible
más
for
allá
it
de
to
las luchas
be
locales y
transnational
que debido a
contact that
el rol
can lead to
internacional
national
tan
struggles.
necesario es en estos
That's
momentos.
why internationalism is so
Como para
important right
señalar que
now,
aquí hay luchas comunes, intereses
to
similares.
us to
Una
highlight that there
segunda
are
pregunta
really
es,
interesting struggles. And
se
a second
refería
question would
al
be
programa ambiental de Petro.
regarding the socio-environmental
Hay que
plan
decir
of
que
Petro.
que ya en la
We have to
realización,
say
digamos, de
that
casi 3 años que lleva el gobierno de Petro,
Pedro's government has been in office for 3 years. There were no real advances. Most of them are speech elements, especially internationally. But regarding the national framework, it is good old capitalism. Pedro even said that he wanted to develop a democratic capitalism, a human capitalism. And that's how the main logic of devastation of the planet for the capital accumulation works in the worst ways. A mafia-like accumulation of capital in which the United States keeps on playing a key role. So this militarization and extraction of minerals in Colombia are deeply linked. Most of the Colombian repressive forces, 65,000 soldiers that are almost 500,000 people, 75,000 of them are in charge of taking care of the energy and mineral regions, in which the part that is expropriated by the company should be taken care of by them. So there has not been substantial advances in that matter of the socio-environmental agenda, but actually an extractivist exporter perspective has deepened. And regarding artificial intelligence, it has many uses, and we are now seeing negative effects of it, heinous ones, not only politically, but also culturally, in education, in the military aspect of it. The use of artificial intelligence by Israel in order to massacre Palestinian people. There are systems of artificial intelligence that Israel uses to control the Palestine population. All of their citizens are identified by fingerprints, face, voice, name. So Palestinian people are prisoners in their own territory. And they are being monitored by artificial intelligence in order for it to provide information that can make bombardments more lethal. The relationship between military objectives and victims in that heinous war language, it was 1 to 10, 1 to 20. Nowadays, with artificial intelligence, they are 1 to 200, 1 to 400. Artificial intelligence kills 300 or 400 people. And you can just digitally program that with people not being present there. So which are the objectives that they should bomb? And then another military officer makes the decision of doing so. And they are not responsible for what this machine does. So there are not a lot of research of how many people were killed by those methods. But it means 15% of the Gaza population. That's like Israeli killing 7 million Colombians, for example. And that's where many smart technology companies of the United States participate in as well, like Microsoft, that works with Israeli forces, murdering forces. So it has a huge, awful effect in terms of political control, to control migrants as well, the country that creates the most sophisticated forms of artificial intelligence, to even to build that huge wall, and they use border security that are designed by Israel. So there's an explicit intention of causing damage and controlling people. And artificial intelligence is also used to make thinking disappear. No critical thinking, just general thinking and using and being assisted by programs like ChatGPT, in which you have to write a report, and, for example, in this context, so then a comrade could say, instead of writing a report, by thinking, by learning and teaching, well, they would just ask ChatGPT to write the political report for them. That is drying out thinking. No more elaboration, no more critical thinking. ChatGPT also cannot elaborate any new information. It only uses already elaborated information. So these are new elements capitalism uses in every level, including climate and environment. The artificial intelligence, as I said, does consume also a lot of water. And in order to finish with this rhythm, internet, digitalization, computers, phones will not have any future or perspective, because it will consume more energy than the amount of energy that it exists. So those are elements that we need to bring to other political spaces. And it is part of this new way of domination, and which are the human, social, environmental aspects that it affects. Thank you, Renan, for your contribution and closure. Thank you so much. Now, Cele's closure.
I think that the questions are key to think about how to intervene in this moment, this historic moment that we have to live in. And as militants and as activists, it is key to be able to respond. With the intervention of the first round of Renan, I think it was clear the difficulty the identity currents or Wokism have to face governments of the far right, sectors that are reactionary, and today they dispute ideologically in different countries, sectors of the youth, sectors of the workers, because I think that the biggest error is to divide, in the sense that the struggle is atomized, women for women's rights, diversity for diversity rights, inside of the collective of the LGBTQ plus as well, because there are sectors that want to divide inside of the women's movement, the feminist movement, the diversity movements, the struggle for trans rights. So that division, and also in regards to
lo preguntaban recién.
the issue, you know, what they ask about racism and the struggle for the collectives, the black collectives here, the brown community here, how that divides by sector. So that is the first difficulty, and the debate is how we unify those struggles. So to the other question, how do we converse with these sectors? It is key to understand that an activist of this current is not the same as a leadership that ends up playing at the service of not breaking the status quo in the frameworks of the capitalist system, because something that we do not propose, at least myself in the beginning, is that this current or Wokism was taken by governments, businessmen, big corporations, having a politically correct discourse, trying to make us believe that there was equality or conquering a law, and that was it. Lenin said that equality in the law is not equality in life. So we fight for that equality in life, equality of everyone, of every day, each of the workers in our countries and in the world. So, as well, to the question in regards to racism and feminism, it has to do with what program we carry out, because we understand that the building of a program that truly questions the foundations of the system that exploit us, that oppresses us, that has different types of oppression, it needs to be that integral program. The attack that this government of the far right carries out is integral to the working class as a whole. So the program we need to build and to raise has to be a program, of course, that brings us to a transition to a society that is truly equal, a socialist society for us. So it needs to be anti-racist, anti-patriarchal, anti-colonial. It has to be anti-imperialist. And for us, it has to be anti-capitalist. And it needs to have a socialist perspective. That unity is the one we need to build. And that's how we build the organizations with which we intervene in these movements to have these debates. Because if we don't act on these movements, these currents, other sectors win, the ones that defend to maintain the status quo and to keep within the limits of the capitalist system, to celebrate our conquest. And we put all of ourselves to fight for those rights that we need to conquer. We need to continue moving forward. But we shouldn't stop there. So that program needs to be integral and to unite each one of these struggles, not dividing. And like I said in the beginning, today this far right, the only way we can defeat it is with unity on the streets. And the unity needs to be reflected, understanding each one of these rights. And of course, it is the building of a political tool that brings each of these measures to the end. And we need a program with these characteristics. So that's why we need an organization, a party, and the need to move forward in the regrouping of the revolutionaries internationally, because now, more than ever, they are the far right, the international far right, that wants to keep on fighting to reset the capitalist system at the service of the powers of a few, instead of the workers and the popular sectors. and the revolutionaries. We need to articulate that meeting each other so we can build that tool. So not only we can wipe them out, and sooner or later we need to be the ones to make the decisions to govern, and we need to end with all kinds of oppression and exploitation.
Gracias, Cele Fierro.
Thank you, Cele Fierro.
Bueno, es el turno entonces de el cierre de Lilli.
And now, Lilli.
Thanks, comrades. I'll try to get through those questions. First question was about denialist agenda in environmental politics in Australia, and whether or not that has played much into the election, and how can we see consequences of this. I think the main thing to understand is that there is very little appetite for Trump in Australia. He's very unpopular. And the association that the Conservatives have with Trump has made them very unpopular as well. And they have tried to disassociate themselves from the Trump agenda in order to save themselves. But if the Conservatives lose this election, it will be because people don't like Trump and don't want a mini Trump in Australia. So it has affected their agenda a little bit, but I think they've tried to talk it down as much as possible so as not to annoy people too much. One example is Peter Dutton, who is the leader of the Conservatives here, is, I guess, climate policy is talking about building nuclear power plants all across the country. And here in Australia, there's a long history of opposition to nuclear power and struggles against uranium mining and nuclear. He wants to overturn the existing national bans that exist and set up 7 nuclear power plants across Australia. He is a bit of a denialist. He said these 7 nuclear power plants will produce 1 Coca-Cola can worth of waste every year, and everything will be fine. This is mostly a way for them to say nothing about climate and hold on to fossil fuels. Not really, and also wage a cultural war. Lots of the strong men around the world, including Millet, love nuclear power and want to use it as a way to kind of boost themselves on the world stage as well as kind of stronger imperial powers. In Australia, this has backfired for Peter Dutton, the Conservative, and actually he has made nuclear power less popular than it was a year ago because of how unpopular he is as a politician. So I don't really think it has affected their agenda all that much, but I think it has affected, I guess, that what the outcome of this election will be very much shaped by what people perceive as the connection to the Trump agenda. I think here people mostly reject it, which is a positive sign. Move on to talk about the second question, which was about how to carry out some of the ideological battles in the universities, or how do we provide eco-socialist perspectives as students on the campuses. I think I don't have any innovative solutions. Socialist groups around the world are always trying to argue to people about ideas and try to convince people that we can change the world and convince people of strategies for how to change it. I think the universities themselves are also complicit in the climate crisis, and it's important to point that out, and that can be a useful focus of organizing. So in the past, I have been part of organizing protests and collective efforts to force the universities to drop their investments in fossil fuels. That can sometimes mobilize people. Also just organizing forums like this one, but much smaller on campuses to attract students to discuss these issues is useful. And then just debating others on these questions when they come up. One thing that has become more common here, I mentioned before, nuclear power. Lots of students go through high school now and are convinced by their science teachers that nuclear power is a really great alternative to the climate crisis. So I think maintaining the socialist position that nuclear power is not an answer, not a solution, and fighting for solutions that can actually fix the climate crisis. I think one thing I haven't really mentioned is, or maybe should emphasize more, is I think we want to argue to people that there is no way to fix the climate crisis under capitalism. Even if we were to switch to 100% renewable energy, tomorrow, which is totally technically possible, that I don't think there is any way that they're going to the capitalists are going to drop their investments in mega fossil fuels. So here, the Labour Party promises, for example, that by 2030, it will be 80% renewable energy. We want to remind people that that doesn't count all of the coal and gas and oil that they're exporting out to all of these other places in the world, trashing the planet. They're never going to drop all of those exports in Australia. It's the kind of backbone of the economy here. So making that argument to people is important, that if you want to fight against climate destruction, you have to be an anti-capitalist. You have to be for revolution. Final question was about Native people in Australia, Indigenous struggle, Indigenous land rights, and the relationship with companies that appropriate their land, steal their land. Yeah, important question. 200 years ago, the first people in Australia had a capitalist social system imposed on them that turned land into a commodity, turned water into a commodity, turned human beings into a commodity, and in order to be bought and sold for profit. And following the invasion and colonization of this continent by Britain, anything that got in the way of agricultural expansion mostly faced a campaign of annihilation, and this included Indigenous people. So the Australian state has been a kind of key driver of this destruction from the very beginning, and it continues today. And it's very important, like I said before, to their competition in the global capitalist market, previously in agricultural products, and today in mining. Yes. I think the struggles of the past by Aboriginal people have been very important in fighting for land rights and fighting back against major mining corporations. There are some laws pertaining to Aboriginal control over land here, but they are a joke, not worth the paper that they're written on. They do not allow traditional owners to refuse mining. If a corporation wants to take the land and there is, ownership in the law over a portion of the land, it's very, very difficult for Indigenous people to defend their land in court because the mining corporations have all of the money, they have all of the lawyers, all of the resources to be able to throw at the system against people who are often very impoverished and oppressed. So it's very difficult. I know this is the case all across the world. So our perspective is to fight for land rights instead of mining rights, push for the rights of Aboriginal people against the enormous corporations that destroy the planet for profit. There was a famous case a few years ago of Rio Tinto's, one of the world's kind of biggest mining companies, blew up Chacón Gorge, which is a sacred site for Aboriginal people in Western Australia, that really shone a spotlight on all of the crimes of mining companies in this country. One thing is they've tried to wokify themselves, these corporations, and provide, they say they have Indigenous solutions, want to employ Indigenous people in order to make themselves look better. I think this is a very shallow veneer. We want to rip all that off, definitely, and expose them for what they are, of the environment. And yeah, the enemies of Aboriginal people. I hope that answers some of the questions. Thanks again, comrades.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Lilli.
Thank you so much, Lilli. Thank you for your efforts. And now it is Justin's turn for his closure. Only I would like to clarify last question that I read to you. We had asked how to strengthen links between Latin American peoples and the struggle against xenophobic measures
la política de los demócratas en
the
materia
political
migratoria,
agenda of Democrats
la
regarding
contradicción entre
immigration,
gobiernos
the
de ultraderecha que
contradiction between
impulsan medidas
far-right
pero que
governments that
necesitan para
want to
expulsar
kick out
en
migrants
sus
but
países
need
y a
them
la clase
to
obrera.
exploit
La
them in
última
their own countries and to divide
sería
the working class. And the last
vos
one,
explicar
if you could explain
cuál sería la solución para
what
evitar las
would be the
migraciones de una
solution
perspectiva socialista.
to deal with migration with a socialist perspective. If there was socialism in Mexico, in Central America, would people migrate or not towards the heart of imperialism?
Tu turno, Justin, entonces.
So it's your turn, Justin. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for those great questions. So I'll do my best to try to touch on each of them. On the first question of strengthening links of solidarity, I think that was the first question of between Latin American people between people across the hemisphere and inside the belly of the imperialist beast. I'd share some just some examples of what actually has been happening and what is currently happening. And I'll start with cross-border labor solidarity. And I'm part of a group called the San Diego Socialists, and we're at the San Diego Tijuana border, and we have over the years formed relationships with socialists in Tijuana in Mexico, who have basically built organizing drives in the maquiladoras. And maquiladoras are there's literally thousands of these production plants or assembly plants, basically factories that are all along the US-Mexico border, concentrated on, well, they're all on the Mexican side of the US-Mexico border. And basically they're in zones that allow for foreign capitalists and investors to basically move their production and assembly facilities into Mexico to take advantage of the cheapened labor, that exists under the conditions, for the most part across Mexico. And so over the years, we formed relationships with groups of organizers, socialist organizers, and we have built solidarity campaigns for their efforts to build independent unions, because they do have unions, but they're fake unions, they're company unions, and they prevent real unionization. And so and this is a collaboration, or has been a collaboration between the U.S. government, U.S. capitalist, entities setting up their production and assembly facilities, the Mexican government at the federal and at the state and at the local level. Up until very recently, all of these colluded to basically keep these production zones union free. In recent months, we have worked in solidarity with our Mexican comrades to support different types of union campaigns in different parts of the country. But most recently, we supported their effort to unionize a factory called Lux Share, which is a Chinese factory, and it used to be called Bose, the speaker radio equipment company. They have 2,400 workers in Tijuana, and there's many of these big factories in Tijuana, but this is one that they strategically began to organize. And so we created solidarity campaigns on this side of the border. In many cases, the headquarters of these companies are on the U.S. side, while the production facilities are on the Mexican side. And there was success in just in the recent months in organizing the Luxshare factory. And so this is significant because there hasn't been a single independent union formed, and there are at least 1 million workers working in these factories on the Mexican side of the border. This is the first union victory, independent union victory since 1998, and that victory was short-lived. So this is what we're hoping to be, an opening for something, for a campaign that we can begin to see this movement continue across the Maquila sector. The second example has to do with the United Auto Workers, where small groups of socialists and left-wing workers have been organizing for many years to get the United Auto Workers to support organizing workers in Mexico, because much of automobile production in North America actually now takes place in Mexico, even though it's largely non-union. And in the recent 2 years, there has been support in getting the United Auto Workers to support an independent union drive to unionize the automobile sector, which in Mexico employs over 500,000 workers. And at every major car manufacturer and producer, has capital invested there. General Motors, all over the world, they produce their facilities there. And so there have been significant victories now in at least two major automotive production facilities that on the U.S. side has had support from the United Auto Workers, but more importantly, on the Mexican side, socialist labor organizers who have built an independent union based on class struggle methods of organizing. Another example that's more local has to do with ICE and the raids in communities and workplaces and different parts of society. An interesting development that has to do with organizing over some time now, because the anti-immigrant movement has been in power now for a while, has been to organize communities of self-defense sort of committees in communities to protect themselves against ICE operations. And so across the Southwest now, we have networks of groups that include socialists, including our group here in San Diego, who basically do patrols, and they patrol communities looking for ICE agents who operate usually undercover, operate in different times of the day to basically invade and try to arrest people. So these patrols have been able to prevent and disrupt these arrests. And this is actually really interesting because this kind of organizing is taking place in different parts of the country, and it's actually significantly impeded Trump's ability to get the deportation numbers that he's striving for. We also have efforts to directly organize immigrant and migrant communities here in San Diego. Close to 40% of the working class are migrants, first generation or second generation migrants from Mexico and Central America. And so we, in our unions, we've made efforts to try to support efforts to create unions or expand unions into immigrant and working class communities. And we've also tried to shift our unions to take a more active sort of defense of the migrant communities. Okay, so those are some of the examples. Talking about the Democrats and the specific role of the Democrats in terms of anti-migrant politics, it's easiest to express this by saying that instead of there being two parties with slightly different politics towards immigration, to think that we have really one party, one capitalist party with a left of center wing and a right of center wing, but that's situated already on the right of the political spectrum. The Democrats, starting in the early 90s, were the party that initiated the border wall, the wall that brought Trump to power, his campaign in 2016. That started under the Democrats. Family detention, putting whole families in detention centers, began under Obama in 2009, a year after he was elected, by promising to legalize all undocumented people. Within 1 year, he changed his position and basically started what's called family detention. The Democrats are responsible for creating policy to allow police to assist in federal agencies and in enforcing immigration. And most recently, the Biden administration set up the machinery to close the border through executive order, which is basically what Trump was advocating for during his campaign. The Democrats actually made it a reality before the election, and so the Democrats played a significant role in shifting politics to the right on the question of immigration. And so not only that, but every time the Democrats win on a pro-immigration platform, they don't undo anything that the previous Republican administration done. They codify it and they normalize it. And so the contradiction between how immigrants are both criminalized and depended upon for exploitation for profit, and this lies in a kind of function that is accepted within both political parties. So the function of exploiting immigrant labor as a very significant way in which our economy operates. And so there are differences in terms of, you know, how many people should be deported. You know, there are wings of the ruling class or factions of the ruling class that are, you know, more far right, like let's deport them all. But then there are others that, like, you know, let's not deport as many. And then there are others that let's not deport any. But what they agree on is essentially maintaining a disenfranchised section of the working class. And the immigrant working class is not insignificant here. It is a very significant part of the working class, not only in numbers and not only in terms of working across industries, but in terms of the resistance. The immigrant working class here has been at the forefront of the struggle, the class struggle, historically and in the most recent period. The immigrant workers exposed how central their labor was to the economy. Back in 2006, when on May Day, 3 million workers went on strike or walked out and closed whole sections of the economy in protest against anti-immigrant policy. So part of the criminalization, it didn't sort of come up completely in a single playbook, but it emerged in terms of what the capitalist economy needed, what was profitable, but also as a way to try to contain and keep immigrant workers under direct control and repression. And so that's kind of where the status quo sets within both political parties. The last thing of, you know, developing, I'm sorry, I'm moving quick here. Developing the significance of developing a revolutionary socialist current, what it would mean. Well, first of all, you know, the socialist current in this country, and I'm not talking about Bernie Sanders or AOC or you know, these phony left-wing, quote-unquote left-wing Democrats that use the term socialism, but I'm talking about the you know, the socialists that are organizing in the unions, that are organizing the communities on the campuses. Have raised very clear demands, going back to 2000, you know, the early 2000s, which is, you know, the fundamental opposition to the border wall. I was, you know, I live in the shadows of the border wall here, and you know, we were organizing, you know, mass protests, you know, against the border wall in the early 90s and calling for its abolition. So there are very explicit internationalist and revolutionary demands: abolition of the border, abolition of ICE. You know, and the right to migrate freely without repression. These are fundamental demands. But what we're able to do in terms of how we organize a revolutionary socialist current today is to build direct connections to work within these these immigrant working class communities, where we are building solidarity. We are supporting the defense campaigns. We are part of working to help unionize and create. Develop more supports and resources for immigrant working class communities. But like I said, we also can build a political alternative, because there is no alternative to the ruling class politics on immigration in this country. Bernie Sanders and AOC are doing an anti-oligarchy tour, right? Trying to recapture the millions of people who have been lost to the Democrats in its incapacity to offer any alternative or resistance to what's happening under Trump. But they're basically completely avoiding talking about immigration because they're complicit. They're both these two leaders of the Democratic left are complicit in anti-immigrant politics. They're also complicit, by the way, in pro-Zionist, you know, being openly pro-Zionist at a time when much of the U.S. population has turned against you know, the genocide and U.S. Complicity in that process. But building a political current that can organize and create alternatives politically to, you know, what continues to dominate left spaces, which is liberal politics. I think all of these things are not only happening, but there's tremendous potential and possibility to build that on a much larger scale in the next year, a couple of years to come.